Welcome once again to Heart of a Shepherd. We are continuing our study of the life of David. Our scripture reading today, Psalm 38. Now, I've titled this psalm, Attacked, Abandoned, and Betrayed. Well, as we're considering the life of David, we certainly have seen all that is in this title a part of this man's life. Well, you'll notice that the title of Psalm 38 is a Psalm of David to bring to remembrance. Now, Psalm 38 does not specify when this worship song was written. However, the content suggests it was during a time of trial, sickness, and sorrow in the king's life. Notice with me the first 5 verses. Now, here we have David's prayer or his plea for mercy. We read in verse 1, O Lord, rebuke me not in thy wrath. That is, don't reprove me or correct me in your anger. Neither chasten me in thy hot displeasure. For thine arrows stick fast in me, and thy hand presseth sore. There is no soundness in my flesh. Because of thine anger, neither is there any rest in my bones, because of my sin. In verse 4, for mine iniquities are gone over mine head. As a heavy burden, they are too heavy for me. My wounds stink and are corrupt because of my foolishness. Well, obviously, reading those 5 verses, we find a man, even though he's the king, absolutely transparent before God. You'll notice that David confessed his sins, and he understood what it meant to suffer and feel abandoned by God, his family, and his friends. In his despair, the king cried out to the Lord for mercy. He could find no rest on his bed. He believed his sins were grievous and the consequences, verse 4, were too heavy. David did not question God's justice and admitted his sorrows were because of his own foolishness. In verse 6 through 10, we have David's complaint of physical illness. We find here the physical effects of David's sin would clearly be a challenge for 21st century doctors and psychiatrists to diagnose. Now, modern medicine would undergo significant changes if doctors focused on treating the whole person, the body, the soul, and the spirit. And so we read in verse 6 David's words, and he says, I am troubled. I am bowed down. Literally, I'm depressed. I am troubled then. I am bowed down greatly. I go mourning all the day long. In verse 7, my loins, that is my stomach, my sides are filled with a loathsome disease, a burning. And there is no soundness in my flesh. In other words, David says my whole body is sick. In verse 8, I am feeble and sore broken. I have roared by reason of the disquietness or the troubleness or the roaring of my heart. Lord, all my desire is before thee, and my groaning is not hid from thee. What a wonderful truth we're studying here. This is how you approach God, with sincerity and transparency. In verse 10, David says, my heart panteth, literally, it throbs, it beats, my strength faileth me. And as for the light of mine eyes, it also is gone from me. You know, the king accurately diagnosed his ailments, which may sound familiar to many readers of this Bible study. Trouble, depressed, mourning, sick, feeble, moaning, groaning, racing heartbeat, physical weakness, and a sense of hopelessness, feeling disheartened. David confessed, the light of mine eye, it is gone from me, verse 10. And then in verse 11 we have David's loneliness. And here he confesses that he has been deserted by both his friends and his family. Verse 11, my lovers, literally my best friends, those who claim to be my friends, my lovers and my friends, stand aloof from my sore calamities. My kinsmen stand afar off. Wow. His friends, his family, and even those of the tribe of Judah, no one was coming to David's aid. So David felt abandoned by his family, his friends, his tribesmen of Judah. Many have experienced the loneliness that David confesses, especially during trials and disappointments and betrayals. You know, when people suffer, whether it is self-inflicted or caused by the sins and the choices of others, even loved ones can seem distant from our pain. Their distance, whether real or perceived, often results from their failure to understand, empathize, or even know how to comfort. You know, helping someone in need isn't about having perfect words. It's more about being physically present. In other words, when you see someone hurting, be there. And don't make the mistake of standing afar off. In verse 12, we have that David's enemies attacked when he was weak. We read in verse 12, they also that seek after my life lay snares for me, and they seek my hurt. Speak mischievous things and imagine deceits all the day long. In one verse, verse 12, David summarized the evil tactics of an enemy. The king's example reminds us to learn the ways and the tricks of an enemy. They aim to destroy your life, and they set traps to weaken your integrity. They hope to cause you to stumble so they can accuse you. And they spend their days lying and plotting your ruin. And yet in verse 13 and 14, David's response to his critics was a refusal to answer them. And so we read in verse 13, but I, as a deaf man, heard not, and I was as a dumb man that openeth not his mouth. That's so interesting. David again says, I acted as though I could not hear, and I could not speak. In verse 14, thus I was as a man that heareth not, and in whose mouth are no reproofs. You know, one of the biggest challenges for a leader is knowing when and how to respond to an enemy's lies, insults, and innuendos. David's response to the curses hurled at him by Shimei during his flight from Absalom's rebellion is certainly instructive. Remember in 2 Samuel 16 that the king's bodyguards wanted to kill Shimei, but David's response was, and I quote, let him alone, and let him curse, for the Lord hath bidden him. In verse 12 of chapter 16, he goes on to say, it may be that the Lord will look on mine affliction, and that the Lord will requite me good for his, Shimei's, cursing this day. You know, a leader must develop thick skin and patience when facing an enemy who is stalking their life and questioning their integrity. Now, that does not mean a leader is helpless. However, there are times and places for reproofs and responding to critics. Notice then, in verses 15 through 19, how David prayed to the Lord and he confessed his sins. In verse 15 we read, for in thee, O Lord, do I hope. Thou wilt answer or hear, O Lord my God. For I said, hear me, lest otherwise they should rejoice over me. When my foot slippeth, they magnify themselves against me. In other words, they look forward to watching and seeing me stumble and even fall. In verse 17, we read, for I am ready to halt or limp, and my sorrow is continually before me. In verse 18, David says, I will declare mine iniquity. I will be sorry for my sin. But mine enemies are lively or alive, and they are strong, and they that hate me wrongfully are multiplied. You know, David's concern was not about his own testimony, but about the Lord's integrity. He was aware of and admitted his failures and sins, and yet he still trusted that the Lord would listen and respond to his prayers. In verse 20, David's enemies hated him for his righteousness. We read in verse 20, they also that render evil for good are mine adversaries, because I follow or I pursue the thing that good is, or that which is the good thing. You know, a tough life lesson is that the people who hurt you the most are often those you love and trust enough to be vulnerable with. David expressed what many know to be true. It is often the ones you have helped who become your enemies and accusers. Indeed, your kindness is sometimes met with evil. And then finally, in verses 21 and 22, David appealed to the Lord for help. We read in verse 21, forsake me not, O Lord, O my God. Be not far from me. Make haste to help me, O Lord, my salvation. You know, Psalms 38 is filled with honest reality checks and ends with a prayer. Forsake me not, O Lord. Now, although David's family, friends, and tribesmen were distant, his desire was, oh my God, be not far from me. He called for help to the one who could deliver him from trouble. In verse 22, make haste to help me, O Lord, my salvation. And so, friend, as I close, if you are committed to being righteous, understand you will face opposition and enemies. I have learned that an enemy plans and schemes, and sometimes our own family, friends, and churches are too quick to believe an enemy's lies. You and I have the right to respond to an enemy, but in God's timing. And so remember, time favors the righteous, and the Lord is on our side when we stand for Him. After 40 years of ministry at one church, I think I have gone through almost all of the things that you have studied today. And I come to the end of that study, the psalm that we're looking at, and realize the best is that the Lord is on my side. May you and I choose to live righteous, even when the enemy is attacking us.